My name is Nathan Reed, and at that graduation ceremony, under the bright stage lights in front of 500 students and their proud families, I walked across the stage and shook hands with my father, the man who had no idea I was his son. The applause roared, but in my ears, everything fell silent. Time slowed. His hand was firm, polite, the same way he greeted all his students. His smile was professional, composed. But as he looked into my eyes, something in his expression flickered just for a second. A shadow of recognition, a question, maybe even fear. But then it was gone. He moved to the next name on the list, and I stepped off the stage, my legs, numb heart pounding like a drum no one else could hear. The truth is, I'd spent 4 years building toward that moment. 4 years earning my way into the honors program, into his inner academic circle, into his world. And now, standing under the banner of Westbridge University, dressed in cap and gown, I was no longer just a student. I was the secret he never expected to see. The proof of a decision made decades ago, standing in flesh and bone, before him, wearing his eyes and my mother's fire. People cheered, cameras flashed, and no one knew that beneath all of it, I had just dropped a silent bomb into a man's carefully curated life. He didn't know me, but I had known him my whole life, and today, whether he realized it yet or not, I had just stepped straight into his story, and he was about to be written into mine. I was raised by a woman who carried too much weight on her shoulders and never once asked the world to lighten it. My mother, Elena, worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to keep the lights on in our apartment and food in the fridge. We lived in a modest 2-bedroom unit above a laundromat where the walls were thin and the floor creaked no matter how gently you walked. I never met my father. Whenever I asked, my mother's voice would go quiet, her gaze drifting off to some faraway place, as if the answer lived somewhere too distant for words to reach. "It's complicated," she'd say, then change the subject. And after a while, I stopped asking, not because I stopped wondering, but because I knew it hurt her too much to answer. I didn't have his name. I didn't have his eyes. At least that's what I thought then. Growing up without a father didn't just shape me, it marked me. In school, when we filled out emergency contact forms or were asked to write Father's Day letters, I felt the invisible gap swell inside me. I hated those moments most. The way teachers hesitated when reading my file, or how other kids whispered after realizing I didn't have a dad in the picture. They didn't mean harm, most of them. But children noticed difference like blood and water. I was the boy with the single mom and no last name connection to anyone important, while others had uncles in law firms or dads who coached their soccer teams. I had my mom's quiet exhaustion and the permanent weight of unspoken stories. Still, she loved me fiercely. That much was never in question. She showed up to every parent-teacher conference, even when it meant skipping a shift. She celebrated every minor success like it was a miracle, and maybe it was considering how little we had. But love doesn't erase longing. And no matter how much I appreciated her strength, part of me still ached for answers. Who was he? Why did he leave? Did he ever wonder about me? Did he even know I existed? The neighborhood we lived in wasn't dangerous, but it didn't offer much in the way of dreams either. Most kids I grew up with either stayed put or drifted off slowly into jobs that looked exactly like their parents. But my mother believed in more for me, if not for herself. She used to say, "You're meant to write laws, Nathan, not just follow them." I didn't know what that meant at the time, but the older I got, the more I realized she was giving me permission to reach further than either of us had ever seen. I worked hard, not because someone pushed me, but because I needed to believe there was a way out. I read obsessively, stayed late in the library, joined every club that would have me. When I got the acceptance letter to Westbridge, my mother cried quietly at the kitchen table, holding the envelope, like it contained the very breath of God. That night she told me, "Your father went there too. He was brilliant. You must have gotten that from him." She smiled, but there was a weight behind it, a kind of sadness I didn't yet understand. That was the first time she'd ever said anything real about him, and I remember thinking, why now? Why tell me that just as I was leaving to chase something bigger? The answer wouldn't come until years later. But in that moment, all I knew was that the man whose name I didn't carry had once walked the same halls I was about to enter. And that somehow, whether I wanted it or not, a part of him was already stitched into my story. I first met Professor Jonathan Ellsworth during the second week of my freshman year in an overcrowded lecture hall that smelled faintly of old wood and ambition. He wasn't the kind of man you forgot. He walked in wearing a tailored grey blazer and a quiet air of control, the kind that didn't beg attention but commanded it anyway. He didn't raise his voice to settle the room he didn't have to. The silence arrived with him like it belonged to him. I sat near the back that day, hunched over a borrowed notebook, expecting the kind of theoretical haze most first-year students get lost in. But instead, he began the class with a question: what makes a society collapse? No preamble, no syllabus, just that direct sharp and uncomfortably alive. For the next hour, he spoke with a rhythm that felt less like teaching and more like unraveling something ancient. Every word seemed weighted, deliberate. He didn't just know policy, he believed it shaped the world we woke up in. I'd never seen someone make politics feel like poetry. By the end of the lecture, I wasn't sure if I wanted to argue with him or become him. It wasn't until weeks later that I saw his name in a faded yearbook in the campus library Westbridge class of 91. Jonathan Ellsworth. The same name my mother had whispered once, almost without meaning to. A name she immediately swallowed after saying it, as if speaking it out loud invited something dangerous. I remember the jolt that passed through me when I read it. I stared at his senior photo for a long time, tracing the shape of his face, the slope of his jaw, the intensity in his eyes. My eyes. I shoved the book closed, heart pounding, trying to tell myself it was just coincidence. A trick of lighting. A fluke. But something inside me, something stubborn and quiet, refused to let go. I didn't tell anyone, not even my mother, not yet. I enrolled in every course he taught, volunteered for every research study he led, sat in the front row, even when I had a migraine or hadn't slept. I became invisible and impossible to ignore at the same time. I didn't need confirmation, not then. I needed access. I needed to see him move, hear him think, feel whatever thread of connection I could find without blowing everything apart. He didn't recognize me, not then at least. Why would he? I was just another ambitious student in a sea of them, one more eager face, chasing distinction. But sometimes when I asked a question, he paused longer than necessary. Sometimes when I spoke in discussion groups, he watched me a beat too long, like something was tugging at the edges of his memory. He never said anything, never hinted that he suspected, but I could feel it in the air between us, faint, electric, unfinished. I told myself I could handle it, that being near him, learning from him would be enough, that I didn't need answers or apologies. I was wrong. The more I watched him move through the world, respected, composed, admired, the more something inside me began to fracture. Because he wasn't just a stranger. He was the missing piece of every question I'd ever buried. And no matter how many lectures I attended, or how many accolades I earned, I couldn't unknow what I knew. The man who shaped nations had once left behind a woman, and the boy she raised alone. And now, unknowingly, he was shaping me. By sophomore year, I was more than just another name on his roster. Professor Ellsworth began noticing me in ways that made it harder to ignore the truth I still refused to fully confront. He started calling on me more often in seminars, asking for my perspective, even when I hadn't raised my hand. One afternoon, after a particularly heated debate on constitutional ethics, he stopped me on the way out of class and said, "You have a mind built for the law, Reed. Don't waste it on being clever. Use it to be clear." It wasn't praise, it was a challenge, and I took it seriously. From that moment on, I made sure my work reflected not just intellect but conviction. I became sharper, more prepared, and to his visible approval, fearlessly honest, in every paper, every debate, every question I dared to throw back at him. Soon, he invited me to join his closed research colloquium, a group of 6 students handpicked from the honours programme. We met every Thursday evening in his office, where the lights were dim and the air smelled of leather-bound books and fresh espresso. Those nights became the heartbeat of my week. We discussed Supreme Court rulings, global policy shifts, historical parallels. No one else in the university dared to tie together. But even in that small, trusted circle, I never let myself slip. I played the part of the gifted student with careful precision. I asked about his time at Yale, his views on federalism, his philosophy on power. Never about family, never about the years between his graduation and my conception. Still, every time he looked at me a moment too long, every time he offered advice that felt oddly personal, I wondered if he saw it too, that flicker, that haunting resemblance he couldn't quite name. One evening after a late session, he asked if I could stay behind to help pack away some case files. When we were alone, he handed me a stack of folders, then paused. "Where did you grow up, Nathan?" The question hung in the air. I kept my voice calm. "North Side, near Briar Avenue." He raised an eyebrow. "Really, I used to live just a few blocks from there. Back in the 90s. I nodded slowly, heart thudding in my chest. Small world. He smiled faintly, then looked away as if trying to grasp something he couldn't quite place. That moment stayed with me long after I left. It wasn't confirmation, but it was the closest we'd come to staring the truth in the eye. The more time we spent together, the more conflicted I became. Part of me wanted to tell him everything, drop the pretense, throw the truth in his face, and watch the walls of his perfect world crumble. But another part of me, the one that still remembered the sound of my mother crying behind a closed bathroom door, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing. I didn't want to give him any more power over my story than he'd already taken. So I stayed silent, polished, brilliant, a shadow of himself sitting directly across from him week after week. He once told our group the most dangerous thing a man can do is rewrite his past to protect his image. I wonder now if he was speaking to all of us or just to himself. By the time junior year began, our dynamic had shifted into something that felt almost familial, though neither of us dared name it. I became his unofficial assistant, helping him sort through dense research papers, organizing case references, sometimes even accompanying him to policy lectures and symposiums outside campus. He introduced me to political analysts, former clerks, authors, whose books I'd once only borrowed from the library. "This is Nathan Reed," he'd say, with calm pride. One of the sharpest minds I've seen come through Westbridge in years. I'd smile politely, always thanking him, but inside, the words hit me in strange places. Praise from a father who didn't know he was speaking to his son, there was nothing normal about that. And yet, I began to crave it. Not just his approval, but his presence. I started looking forward to the moments between meetings when he'd casually mention a speech he gave in '97, or the first time he saw Berlin in winter. Every story filled in blanks I'd lived with for years. And without meaning to, I started building a picture not of the man my mother had once loved, but of the man I might have known if he hadn't walked away. Sometimes I wondered if I was manipulating him, but the truth was more complicated. I didn't want revenge. Not really. What I wanted was connection, even if it was one-sided. I wanted to understand how a man like him, so principled, so articulate, so endlessly aware, could have made a decision that left an entire life unacknowledged. And I wanted to know deep down if he would have done it differently had he known I was watching. We never spoke of personal things directly, but the boundary between professor and student began to blur in ways no one else could see. He invited me to his home once after a late conference because it was too far to drive back to campus. The place was minimalist, all clean lines and wood floors, the kind of space that didn't feel lived in but rather maintained. He poured us coffee in silence, and for the first time, I saw the fatigue in him, the weariness of a man who had built an empire of influence, but maybe left something of himself behind. We sat on opposite sides of a long oak table and for a while said nothing at all. Then he asked me, "Did your father ever teach?" The question hit me like a punch I didn't see coming. I kept my face neutral, heart clawing at my ribs. "No," I said. "He was never around. He didn't push, just nodded slowly and stared out the window into the dark." And in that silence, I swear something passed between us, unspoken but real. Back on campus, students began to notice how close we'd become. Some whispered, others asked if I was angling for a reference letter to Yale Law. Maybe I was, maybe not. All I knew was that being near him gave me a strange kind of gravity, like I was slowly pulling something out of hiding. And still I said nothing. Still I waited, because I wasn't ready yet not to confront him, not to ask the question that had lived in my chest since I was 8 years old and found that torn photograph in my mother's drawer. Not until I knew what I'd do with the answer. Not until I understood whether the boy in me wanted a father or justice. The evening it happened was quiet, unremarkable. On the surface, a campus event celebrating 25 years of Jonathan Ellsworth's service to Westbridge. The kind of gathering where former students flew in just to shake his hand again, and university donors lined up to speak his praises over 2 sweet wine and miniature hors d'oeuvres. I stood near the back of the hall at first, just another face in a crowd of polished alumni and eager undergrads, but I was watching him, always watching. He looked sharp in a tailored navy suit, hair grayer than it had been when I first met him, but eyes as focused as ever. He moved through the room like a man used to being respected, maybe even adored, but that night something in him seemed heavier. Not tired exactly, more like reflective, like someone who knew the years had slipped by faster than he expected. When the dean called him to the podium, polite applause rose. He stepped forward, adjusted the microphone, and began, in that steady voice I knew too well. "I never thought I'd stay in one place this long." He started glancing out at the room. "When I first came to Westbridge, I was 35, recently divorced, still figuring out what kind of man I wanted to be. Teaching was supposed to be temporary, just a year or two. But then something happened. I fell in love with this place, with the questions we ask and the young minds brave enough to ask them." A soft laugh moved through the crowd. But I didn't laugh. I was frozen. Divorced at 35. That would have been the year I was born. He continued, voice dipping lower. "I've made a lot of choices in my life. Not all of them good. Not all of them brave. There were moments I walked away from things I should have stayed and fought for. Moments where I thought I was protecting someone by disappearing. But with time, I learned that absence isn't always mercy. Sometimes it's just fear dressed up in logic." His words hit me like a freight train, subtle yet unmistakable. Around me, people nodded thoughtfully, unaware of the seismic shift taking place in my chest. He wasn't looking at me directly, but I felt it, his gaze hovering at the edge of where I stood, never quite settling, but never straying far either. Later that night, long after the guests had filtered out and the music faded, I found him sitting alone in the faculty garden behind the hall, nursing a glass of whiskey, the loosened tie draped around his neck like an afterthought. I didn't ask to join him. I just sat down. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick with what neither of us knew how to name. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "There's a point in every man's life when he has to decide whether to bury the truth or dig it up no matter how ugly it might be." I said nothing, but I wanted to scream. "Tell me. Say it. Say you remember her. Say you wonder if I could be yours. Say anything." But he didn't. Eventually he stood and gave me that same unreadable look he always did, half curious, half cautious, and said, "Good night, Nathan. You're going to do great things." Then he walked away, leaving behind a trail of unsaid things heavier than any speech he'd given. That night I realized the truth wasn't far anymore. He felt it. I saw it, but we were both still dancing around the fire, afraid of getting burned. It happened 2 weeks later in his office. Late afternoon golden light slanting across the bookshelves, casting long shadows over the framed degrees and faded photographs that lined his wall. I hadn't planned it, not really. I'd told myself I was just dropping off a draft of my senior thesis, but something inside me was done waiting, done wondering, done dancing around a truth we both felt like smoke in a sealed room. He looked up as I entered, eyes tired but warm. "Nathan," he said with that familiar calm. "Come in." I closed the door behind me. My hands trembled slightly as I placed the folder on his desk. He didn't notice, or maybe he did, but said nothing. "Before I go," I said carefully, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." He gestured toward the chair across from him. Of course, I didn't sit. I stood there, heart pounding, like it was trying to punch its way through my chest. "Did you ever know a woman named Evelyn Ford?" The question landed like a thunderclap in the quiet. His brow furrowed instantly, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw genuine discomfort ripple across his face. He leaned back slightly. "That's a name I haven't heard in a long time." My throat tightened. "You knew her?" "Yes," he said slowly. "We were close. It was brief. A long time ago." "Why do you ask?" I swallowed hard, forcing the next words out, even though they felt like broken glass in my mouth. "Because she's my mother, and I'm her son." Silence. Not the kind that sits politely between conversation, but the kind that collapses everything. He stared at me, not blinking, not breathing, just staring like someone who had walked off a cliff and hadn't yet realized he was falling. "Nathan," he said finally, but the word cracked mid-syllable. "I didn't know." I nodded slowly. "She never told you. She said you were married, that she didn't want to ruin your life." His hands moved instinctively to his mouth, covering it for a moment before dropping back to the desk. Jesus Christ. The words weren't angry. They were broken. He stood up, walked to the window, and pressed his palm against the glass, like he needed the cold to ground him. I waited. For apology. For denial. For anything. Finally, he turned. "All these years," he whispered. "And you've been here. In front of me." "I didn't see it. I think part of you did," I said quietly. "You just didn't let yourself believe it." His face crumpled, not dramatically, not with tears, but with something deeper. Regret. Deep and wide and bone level. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "I missed everything. Your childhood. Your first steps. Your birthdays. I wasn't there. I should have been." "It's not about what you missed," I said. "It's about what you do now." We stood there in a silence neither of us could name. Not closure, not yet, but no longer denial. He took a slow breath, then walked over to me, placing a hand gently on my shoulder. "You didn't come here for validation," he said. "You came here for truth, and I owe you all of it." My voice barely rose above a whisper. "Yes, you do." And in that moment, the walls that had separated us for decades cracked. Not enough to fall completely, but enough to let light in. I don't remember walking off that stage. I remember the light, though, how it hit the podium, how it softened Jonathan's face when we stood side by side. For a moment, I wasn't the boy abandoned or the man proving himself. I was just his son. There were no cheers, no dramatic music, no big cinematic moment, just stillness, a quiet, trembling kind of grace that wrapped itself around me like a second skin. We didn't talk much after that day. There were no family dinners or long phone calls, but a door had opened. And even if neither of us fully stepped through, at least it wasn't locked anymore. I moved to DC after graduation, took a fellowship with a non-profit that helped low-income youth navigate the legal system. I thought the past would stay in Westbridge, neatly folded into my diploma. But memory doesn't work like that. It trails you, sometimes in echoes, sometimes in mirrors. One night I was walking home, late and cold, when a kid stopped me outside the metro station. Maybe 17. Angry eyes guarded posture, too proud to say he was lost, but too shaken to hide it. I bought him a sandwich. We sat in silence while the city moved around us like a current. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to thank me, it was to ask, You ever feel like you're building your life from something someone else destroyed? That question sat with me for weeks. And if you've ever felt that too, like you're piecing together your future out of broken parts you didn't ask to inherit, I just want you to know you're not alone. This channel was created to tell stories like that. Real ones, quiet ones that begin with hurt but don't end there. If those stories mean something to you, I hope you'll subscribe not just to follow along, but to stand with a community that understands. Because sometimes hearing someone else's story helps you finally make sense of your own. As for Jonathan, we spoke one more time. Briefly. A letter arrived months later, handwritten. He said he was proud, that he'd watched the graduation video over and over, that for the first time in his life, he saw the cost of silence. He never asked for forgiveness, and maybe that's what made it easier to give. I keep the letter folded in my wallet, not because I need it, but because it reminds me of something I once heard, that healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper, a presence, a pause between what hurt you and what no longer does. I still use the name Nathan Reed. That will never change. But now, when someone asks me where I come from, I don't hesitate. I say, it's a long story, but it's mine. And that finally is enough.